Hey there, our first episode with self-proclaimed Chief Elder Officer Neal Shah lit the internet on fire. And today, he is back on the podcast to dig a bit deeper into some of his most viral internet moments and talk more about the caregiving crisis that is at our doorstep. Hi there, I'm Teri Hart, your host of the Hart of It All, a weekly podcast all about caregiving. Thanks so much for being here. And to make sure you don't miss an episode, please make sure you are following or subscribing wherever you listen or watch this pod. We are over the moon to have Neal Shah back on the podcast. After his own caregiving experiences, Neal decided to switch careers and dedicate his life to the caregiving space. Neal's hot takes frequently go viral on Instagram and TikTok, and we thought it was time to have America's Chief Elder Officer back on the heart of it all to talk about why caregiving is such an important issue and what he is hearing from folks in his day job at CareYaya and on social media about what caregivers need to make their experience better for them and their loved ones. Neal, welcome back to the heart of it all.
Hey, thanks for having me, Teri. Glad to be here.
I want to start with a deeper dive into an idea that went super viral
Yeah.
after your first appearance here on the podcast. And you said that caregiving should be a diagnosis. A lot of people, like hundreds of thousands of people, have responded to that clip. Why do you think that that has resonated so far and wide?
Because I think it's a lived reality for many. I've been a caregiver myself like twice in my 30s, and I noticed a significant impact on my health. And I think a lot of people are living it today and realizing that, hey, why isn't there support for me? Like, can you imagine if something happened in your life? Like, let's say if something happened in your life that said, because of this thing in your health, you're now having a 500% increase in your likelihood of getting dementia. People would treat that as like a diagnosis that you have a condition and let us help you treat that condition, blood sugar, whatever, right? Let's put you on diabetes meds. Well, unfortunately, if your wife gets dementia, that is true. 500% increase in diagnosis. Actually, sorry, I misspoke. If your husband gets dementia, it's 500% increase. If your wife gets dementia, it's 1,200% increase. So it's actually statistically interesting. That was a Cache County study that came out, and it's been out for over a decade, that they studied spousal caregivers of dementia, and they correlated, adjusted for everything else, age, race, income, health, whatever. If your spouse had a dementia diagnosis, your own likelihood of getting it over the next 5 to 10 years literally went up hundreds of percent. So, I mean, that should be a diagnosable condition then. Your spouse getting dementia means you are a caregiver, and that's a diagnosis.
Yeah.
Same with cancer. I think people who are cancer caregivers, enormous effect on their own mental health, their physical health, their likelihood of ending up in the ER with a heart issue. I mean, I run a large caregiving platform supporting family caregivers. I see this all the time. People are ending up in the ER, and it's not the person that's needing the care. It's the husband, wife, son, daughter, because of the stress of it all. So I think that, yeah, it should be. We need to think about the way the system treats it, both from a diagnosis means XYZ is going to happen to you health wise, right? So, like, I think that's one definition of diagnosis, but also in the way at least the American medical system works is diagnosis means there's a billing code. And now the healthcare system does something, right? The health insurance company does something, Medicare does something. Without a billing code, nothing happens. So I also mean by making it a diagnosis, finally, there's a financial incentive in the system to do something about it. Whereas like currently caregiving, gets no support. It doesn't even get recognized in the healthcare system. It's not even in the medical record. So, I think, yeah, can you imagine, tens of millions of people across the country are currently caregiving, 15, 20, 25 hours a week. That's nowhere in their medical record. And then if they show up at the doctor and it's like, oh, why do you have a heart issue? Well, it's like, well, what have you been doing? I've been caregiving. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been
Yeah.
working a full-time job,
Hmm.
caregiving and parenting, et cetera, et cetera. One
Yeah.
of the things that I know organizations here in Canada, like the Canadian Centre for Caregiving Excellence and the Ontario Caregiver Organization, one of the things that they struggle with and that they're trying to change is people identifying as caregivers, not just saying,
Yeah.
I'm just a daughter, I'm just a niece, I'm just a son, whatever, but identifying as caregivers. And I think that that is an issue to that billable code that you mentioned, to the support so that we can see the numbers actually of people that this is a reality for them.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that, Neil, about people going, oh, wait, this isn't just every day. This is another thing on my plate and it has an effect.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up about identifying as caregivers. And I think that also goes to the failure of the healthcare system. I would say, like, cynically, how convenient that we don't help people identify as caregivers because then the society can dump the entire burden on them unpaid. It's like, okay, if society was doing something wrong, this is the way to do it. In the US, at least, I don't know the Canadian statistics. In the US, the conservative estimate is $1 trillion of economic value from unpaid caregiving for a loved one through serious illness or dementia. And that's from AARP. Boston Consulting Group put out a higher estimate of 3 trillion to 3.5 trillion. So, we can take whatever midpoint of that maybe. Of the GDP, 10% to 15% of the entire economy is on the back of this unpaid caregiving. And if you kind of think about, an injustice that if the government and healthcare system were to try to dump trillions of dollars of work on the backs of people without paying them and without supporting them, then it makes sense. Let's not even have them identify that they're doing it and let's like trick them into doing it for free because they don't even recognize that they're a caregiver. So I think that all of this is a push for change in the right direction that, maybe at the time that your mom or dad or your husband or wife gets diagnosed with dementia, the system would immediately say, you now have a diagnosis, you are a caregiver. You start thinking about it and internalizing it. Then you start realizing, hey, wait, I'm doing all this stuff. This is going to be a big challenge for me. I don't know what I'm doing. So I might need, some training and support. That means that the system might say, okay, how can I get you caregiver training so that you can have confidence in what you're doing, you don't mess up. Then the health insurance, system might say, okay, this person has now X amount of higher risk of their own health issues. Maybe we should give them some resources. Then Medicare would say, maybe we need to pay for some respite care so this person can get a break. I think that maybe the diagnosis and the self-identification as caregiver starts the entire like stream of, domino effect, if you will.
Okay, so you've dedicated your life to this after being a hedge fund manager. You decided to dedicate your life and your career to making the experience for caregivers better. So, in your experience, what does qualify as a caregiver, Neil?
That's a great question. I think it's a variety of tasks, but I'd say maybe the definition is somebody who can't fully take care of themselves. You, as the person, are spending a notable amount of your time doing it for them, whatever the task may be. I think that's like a kind of a loose definition, but I think that would catch tens of millions of people
Yeah.
who might not even be realizing they're doing it. And by the way, I think that's a conservative definition. Like when I was caregiving, I mean, there was weeks of spending upwards of 20, 30 hours a week on it. Many of the caregivers I've met and I've helped, sometimes they're spending 50 hours a week on it. People have quit their jobs to do it, and it's more stressful and more time than their actual job. So I think there's a quite a spectrum of people, and quite a spectrum of people with ailments that make it so that they can't do anything for themselves. Why is this stuff being done unpaid? It's absolutely critical for keeping society running, and I think that's something we should all be thinking about too.
One of the things I want to address is a bit of a misnomer or an elephant in the room about people have responded to some of our clips from this podcast from the first time you
Mhm.
were on it and saying, what about parents? Parents are unpaid caregivers. What differentiates parents of healthy, able bodied children and unpaid caregivers of people, seniors, or loved ones that are not their own children?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. I think it's not either or. I think it should be yes and. That I think society in general should be providing a lot more support for parents as well. And I think that we have taken massive strides in the last 3 or 4 decades to provide things like maternity leave, then paternity leave. I don't. And by the way, I don't think these are great by any means. At least here in the U.S., some of these policies that these companies have is not great, and the government doesn't have enough of it. But, I think there are strides. But I think as anyone who's gone through it, and I've kind of been in both, right? I'm a parent. I've also been a spousal caregiver, and I've also been a caregiver of an older adult. Anyone who's gone through these varying experiences, the stress both physical stress as well as like emotional stress of caregiving for somebody with major illness or disability is quite a bit different, from caregiving in a parental capacity, both in terms of the responsibilities, that you have, the disruption in your own life, as well as like the sadness and the toll. And I would say critically, the trajectory of what is going to happen. I think oftentimes there's a big difference in how you respond to it, that parents of a, kind of like a healthy child generally are doing it with it's reducing over time and there's like something to look forward to. Caregiver of somebody with cancer, dementia, etc., is often doing it sometimes in a sudden, acute manner, and it may or may not improve. Many cases getting worse. Actually, some of the most stressful situations that I see in the caregivers we help are parents of children with special needs. It is unbelievably stressful, and that I think actually that is one of the hardest things that I've seen in society. Not that I mean they're all hard, but I think in many of these cases they know that they're in it for life. So yeah, I think it really depends on the trajectory of the person that you're caring for. I think sometimes shapes your experience and your stress response to it.
I also think, some of the things that conversations that I've had because doing this podcast and getting that feedback from people about
Yeah.
what unpaid caregiving looks like compared to, or adjacent to parenting and what it comes down to. And you intimated it there, but just to put a final, bit of an exclamation point on it is it's an infrastructure and recognition issue in my mind. There
Yeah.
is infrastructure for parents from daycares to, on the job daycare. In Canada, we have up to 18 months maternity and paternity leave. We
Wow.
are
Wow. That's awesome.
It
Yeah.
is awesome.
Yeah. It's like
And
never heard of that in the US, sadly.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And so we have recognition and infrastructure, and I think I don't wanna put one above the other, but the recognition is such a huge part. Like, you see somebody who's become a new parent, and the first thing you do is touch their arm and say, "How are you doing?" There's a recognition that
Mhm.
it is difficult. You see
Yeah.
somebody who is managing a loved one, or a person, might not even be a loved one, who's living with dementia or living with cancer, and a lot of people
Yeah.
bypass it completely. So, the recognition is a huge factor. And I know when we post this, people are going to freak out, but
Mhm.
there is a difference. And part of moving this dial for caregivers is recognizing the difference.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I would even add to that, because I've been in all of these caregiving situations. Like when I had a child, think about my life experience of work and social. Everybody's like, "Oh, let me see pictures of your daughter. Like, oh, so cool. Oh, let's hear updates. Oh, it's like all positive, all supportive, all like, let me hear more. I think is general the response from a work setting, from any kind of like social setting, or whatever. Taking care of my wife with cancer, don't get me wrong, like support, but it's like, let me do the expected polite thing to say. You could just read the other person and then let's just move on because this is very sad and I don't want to hear about it, right? And all of my friends or caregivers that I help through my work, anyone's like, hey, my spouse has dementia. Actually, I know one gentleman that I'm thinking about in his late 50s. His spouse has like early onset. Like no one wants to hear about it. And he's like, look, I can't even blame him. It's so sad because everybody's planning their retirement. Everybody's planning, yeah, I'm going to golf. I'm going to do all this. And, meanwhile, he's like, oh, my wife's getting worse. And, oh, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. So I think there's a huge difference. Like, imagine if he was like in a situation where, hey, my wife and I just had a kid. Everybody would be proactively asking more questions, supporting, celebrating. Who's celebrating and who's doing anything positive for somebody who has taking care of a spouse or a parent with dementia, cancer, serious illness? No one. Yeah, maybe after the person dies, they might send some flowers, right? But I think it's like, I don't think it's even close. So, I mean, yeah, I think people can kind of like think about it, but I think anyone who's been in the variety of caregiving situations would know that one of them, the stress and challenge of caregiving is coming with a positive. in terms of like the parenting a healthy child. And I think in the other situation, the stress and burden of caregiving is not coming with much positive from any of your friends, colleagues' work. And on top of that, is grossly undersupported. Like if you say that I have a child, I don't think, I hope, most people's manager is not going to judge them that, oh, you're not going to be focused on work. They're going to think, okay, maybe for a while, you will have some disrupted sleep and all that. But generally, it's viewed as kind of like a positive, right? If you say that, hey, I'm caring for my mom with dementia, like immediately all of these employers, their managers, whatever, are just thinking, oh, this person's going to be distracted. They're going to be ducking out for doctor's appointments. They're going to be ducking out for this. And it's going to get worse over time, not better. So, yeah, I think that it's not even close. Like the employer doesn't support any of this illness-based caregiving, and I think people, as a result, keep it to themselves. Like, how many people share with their colleagues that they're parents? Like almost everyone, right? Very few people share with their colleagues that their spouse has a serious illness or their mom or dad has dementia, and they're kind of in it. Most people are keeping that private for a reason because they know it's not going to be supported. It might be judged. They might get passed over for promotion. So yeah, I think it's like it's not even close.
Neil Shah, your first post on Instagram
Yeah.
was September 1st, 2025. And you spoke about Labor Day and that there
Mm.
is no day off for caregivers. That was your very
Yeah.
first post on
Oh, that's
Instagram.
awesome. Yeah, kind of. I don't remember that, but that's cool. Yeah.
Well, I'm here to
Cool.
remind you.
Thanks.
Um,
Yeah, I've written a couple articles about that too. Yeah, I think I like that topic. Yeah.
what is it that you saw in social media? Your growth is extraordinary. You have over a
Thank you.
million followers across platforms.
Thank you.
People use you as a resource. People are feeling seen in your
Yeah.
posts. What was it that you saw as a businessman
Mhm.
in social media that you could accomplish with social media? And how has it evolved with, as I mentioned, that extraordinary growth?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for the question. So I'm actually like at heart like more of a private person. Like I've not even been on many of these social media platforms like Instagram or Facebook or whatever. Even as a consumer, I'm in my mid 40s and I've just been kind of like away from it. And so it's kind of like a little bit of a leap to not only join as a user but also as a posting person. Like a lot of my friends are like making fun of me, for that because everybody knows I'm private. And also, I'm kind of like a little more shy and introverted. I'm passionate about certain topics, but most of the time, I don't, I just like don't want to talk unless it's a topic I'm interested in. And I also don't like attention on myself. So there have been some growing pains, so to speak, because it wasn't like natural. I was writing a lot. Like for years, I've been writing because that's my more preferred activity. I like to read and I like to write, but I felt like it wasn't reaching as many caregivers. So I was thinking about this, like, let's say over the last 2 or 3 years, I've written a lot of things. Like, I've written opinion articles in like LA Times. I've written like letters to editor and like New York Times, Washington Post. I've written tons of opinion articles in many regional like newspapers, blogs, things like that of caregiving advocacy, which I think is a tip of the iceberg in terms of it sometimes reaches policymakers and people who might be in a position of influence. The only social media that I've been on in my adult life was LinkedIn. So then, like a couple of years ago, I was just like starting to write on it, and again, not really reaching caregivers, but I was like, okay, at least there is a way to disseminate the message. And then, I think the catalyst last year was just like thinking through, okay, a lot of caregivers I know and I've talked to are very active in Facebook support groups. They're very active, increasingly so on Instagram. Many of them are turning to things like YouTube and even like TikTok to some degree. So I was like, okay, why not take an experiment and just put this stuff out? As you can see from the content, I mean, it's like very like that. There's zero production skill. It's like just like walking around the building after hours of like a long day at work, just kind of like this, talking to the thing, into the phone. But I think that it's like authentic, in the sense of it's not very well edited, scripted, or whatever. It's just like, hey, this is like an interesting thing that I find. The most important thing is I just want to directly reach caregivers, and I think that there were a few things I was trying to accomplish. Initially, one was just making people feel seen. I think that was like the genesis of it. And then I assumed that as many people commented and replied, then everybody could see each other,
Mm.
So I think that that was the initial impetus of it. And then over time, I think it's grown into like hey, anything helpful that I find that might help the person as a caregiver. If you're worried about XYZ, maybe here's some things you can do, such as like, let's say dementia risk reduction. I know that is like a front and center of many caregivers' mind. I just thought that there was a huge gap of like caregivers both are in the midst of like very difficult and stressful work. Caregivers are massively strapped for time. And then longer term, just thinking like if you can build a community, I think there isn't um, like there are many of them online, but there isn't like truly a very large community. It's an awesome ability to reach people. And just like most important, like improve somebody's day. I think that's been the number one thing. It actually provides a lot of motivation because like through my direct innovation work, I can reach a bunch of people. Like we run a very large caregiving platform. We run a lot of research projects to improve caregiver training, to improve early screening of dementia. But like those things will reach like 1/100th, maybe 1/1000th of the people that we can reach through social media. So I think that's kind of cool is that you can just reach like millions of people and improve, hopefully improve their lives, even if it's for like 2 minutes out of the day. Yeah.
Okay, so you've got America and a lot of other places of the world covered. The Heart of It All is doing our job here in Canada, so we'll
Yeah.
make sure between the 2 of us that
Nice. That's
we've
awesome.
got a bunch of North America covered, okay?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's kinda cool. I mean, there's caregiver audiences even in some of these other countries. We have
Yeah.
people reach out from the UK, from Australia, from India, from all these countries. It's a human thing. It's not just a one country thing. I mean, I think tons of people are going through caregiving and populations are aging rapidly globally, and there aren't enough people to take care of all of them. So I think it's a global phenomenon.
Can you narrow down in this almost year that you've been on social and you've been creating this community,
Mhm.
what are, like, the top 3 caregiving issues that are really resonating with people?
One is just lack of support. I think lack of support is probably the biggest one. Lack of financial support for caregiving, I think, might be the absolute biggest one, both in terms of their own income hit from reducing their work hours or quitting their jobs, combined with they not getting paid to care for a loved one, combined with having to shell out of pocket to get a break and the unaffordability of getting paid care help and lack of kind of like any kind of funding for that from a health insurance or government perspective. That's probably, like I'd say, by far and away number one, is that the system does not support and the system fully puts it back on you. So I think that's one. And I guess you could categorize within lack of support as also lack of education and training and preparation for what you're supposed to be doing. I don't know if that would be a separate topic or part of that same topic. I think second might be kind of like mental health. That there is a enormously complex mental health challenge of caregiving, both from like the acute stress of when you first step into the role and don't even know it, and then the ongoing challenge, especially for many people who have been in it for 3, 5, 7 years, where a loss of identity of who you were, the things you like to do, the joy you had, etc., and then the full absorption of identity as my entire like life existence is to keep this other person alive and safe, combined with kind of like the whole grief of the process while the loved one is gradually fading and potentially even losing abilities in front of your eyes, and then obviously the post death, and then all the grief thereafter, and the lack of ability to recapture a role or identity post death. I think that is a enormous, enormous issue. Tons of people reach out to me who are in their 70s and 80s, and they resonate with the thing. And then when I talk to them, they're like, "Oh, my caregiving ended 4 years ago." And it's like at first I was like, "Oh, this is like very interesting." I'm surprised that the stuff resonated with you. And they're like, "Yeah." And then since then, I went through a long grieving period and I don't even know who I am anymore because I was a caregiver for 7 years prior to that. So I think that's like, it's really interesting. And to be totally honest, it happened to me in the same way. But because I was younger, I was able to recreate identity in my late 30s by like shifting my life's work and focus into like supporting caregivers, doing caregiving innovation, things like that. But had I been, 78 instead of 38, when I was post caregiving, who knows? Like I might not have been able to recreate an identity and might have just been like, I have been a caregiver for so long and then I'm a former caregiver. And how am I going to, what is my new identity? No one knows. So I think that I really empathize with that. And that is a surprisingly common issue. And I think it's like really under discussed. So I think that's one. And I I think that's 3. I don't remember. I lost count
I
for
think that
sure.
that idea about identity and who you are is so, so profound. And I don't think it necessarily even has to be the difference between 38 and 78. I think that there
Yeah.
is, every single decade of life, once that profound change happens for you,
Mhm.
it is the question of who am I now? There's so much research being done now about dementia reduction risk.
Yeah.
What have you discovered and how popular are those posts on your social media channels?
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of people are like very interested in these topics. And I think I've discovered a lot of things just from like reading a lot of literature that are, kind of like non pharmaceutical interventions that people can do. And they should start early. And they also coincidentally happen to be just like generally fun or positive things. Like there's like no risk or downside to doing them. Probably the number one thing is dancing. In a study of like 11 different activities at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, over a 15-year period, it was the number one of risk reduction. And I think the hypothesis being that it's physical movement combined with socialization and social activity, as you're like coordinating with one or more people, combined with, just kind of complex cognitive processing of like remembering your steps and like thinking about what you should be doing and syncing to the music. So number one, activity far and away. And it's like also, what's the harm in that? It's like fun, it's uplifting, but at least that study I think showed a 47% risk reduction. Like, holy crap, like that's like what a magic drug, right? Then probably number two is just like overall sleep length, what you do after waking, like and how it impacts our circadian rhythm. I think all of these things, so like there's a broad category, so I'll say, don't check your phone within half an hour of waking up. Even I recently did one around like, don't check the news within half an hour of waking up. I know these are things that many people do, but actually after reading the research, I try not to do, because it really elevates cortisol levels. But this is a very difficult thing because whenever I recommend it, I mean, all the caregivers are like, look, this is all great and all, but I can't get 6 hours sleep uninterrupted. And I've been in that boat too. So it's very hard to recommend when you don't have any help. But that is like a key correlator to your own risk of dementia. Like in that Cache County study that I mentioned, why spousal caregivers have 500% higher risk of dementia. One of their main hypotheses is spousal caregivers of dementia have ridiculously interrupted sleep compared to cohorts of the same age with every other health condition, income condition adjusted. And that might be the single most important variable. So it's just something to think about. I mean, there's no like easy solution, but maybe that's like a good policy making,
My Wordle
suggestion.
playing is going to take a hit, Neil. I play Wordle first thing in the morning.
I know, I know, I know. And by the way, that Wordle does help. So, it's kind of like you got to pick your, yeah, weigh that balance. Then, like some other things were cooking, like cooking really reduces risk of dementia. And it's not just because you're eating healthier, but it's also like the cognitive stimulation of the act and kind of the joy of it. So I thought that was interesting. And then we were talking right before we started the episode, coffee and tea, just caffeinated beverages 2 to 3 times a day within reason, 20% lower risk over a multi-decade study. So I think it's just kind of like interesting, but all of these things in moderation. If you consume in excess of 6 cups of coffee, your risk actually increase. So it's kind of interesting to think about. But I think overall, yeah, I think people should try to educate themselves on lifestyle factors because there's an increasing awareness that what you do when you're 50 affects like your brain health when you're 70 and 75. And many of these neurodegenerative conditions aren't like, even though the onset might feel sudden, the making of them in your brain was happening over 20, 30 years. So it's kind of like useful for people to think about.
We are in a time where everybody is obsessed with longevity. There
Hmm.
are, I know of like, I don't know, 4 podcasts about caregiving. There are about 4,000 podcasts about longevity. And there seems to me to be a disconnect between health span and lifespan when people are talking about longevity. Maybe that's just me, but I'm wondering from your point of view. And I think it's important to recognize that you're not a doctor here, but you study
Hmm.
these things in a
Yeah,
very
yeah,
fundamental way.
yeah.
What do you think are the pros and cons of the longevity movement when it comes to caregiving and talking about natural decline of aging?
Yeah, good question. I think that one of the biggest, I mean, in general, I think the pro of longevity movement is just that hopefully we're encouraging people to intentionally focus on how they're living today so that they can live longer, healthier lives. The con of longevity movement, I would say, is the movement is really ageist, in a way. So I kind of push back on it a lot, where it is creating a insane fear of aging. It is creating this, in my opinion, kind of like a perhaps like anti-spiritual view of like death, and death as something to be feared, not just as a natural part of the life journey. And at an extreme, it may turn people against older people because they'll view it as like, hey, look at, because if you think about who the longevity movement is propagated by, it's mostly like 40 to 50-year-old men, for the most part, some women too, who are heavily doing fake things. Like, this, what's the guy's name? I can't remember. Brian Johnson, like who's all talking about biohacking and look at all these cool things I'm doing and look at my skin, and my biomarkers indicate that I'm a 25-year-old and I'm a 40 something year old. I feel like that is kind of the hype. And then on the women's side, similarly, like I think everybody's bragging about I'm really this old, but look at my age is this old. And then it's like a fine line between what people are doing and then how many fake things they're doing in terms of cosmetic appearance related. So I do feel like that obsession of youth is a little bit, kind of like anti my own values, because it makes anyone think whoever doesn't have the means to do that or just didn't do all these fake things, there's something wrong with them. And I think that I'd like to see 70-year-olds just being natural 70-year-olds celebrated for who they are. And then, yes, focus on their health so they can live longer, but not that, oh, you look like this. You didn't do all this longevity stuff, that I do all this collagen and Botox and I take all these supplements and all that. So I feel like the ruse here is that the longevity movement is using something that should be good for society and people should naturally, want to live healthier, but then spinning it into a way to pump billions of dollars of fake stuff to have people chase youth, and then at an extreme to chase this thing of immortality. And I think many people on the frontier of longevity are like chasing that, which I personally just don't think that is a worthwhile goal. Like I'm totally comfortable with that, and I think it's just a natural part of life. So I think there's almost like I'd say it's as like a very spiritual person, it's like the movement is like kind of against most of my values. I feel like it's a atheistic, non-spiritual movement that is like worshiping at the wrong altar.
There's also a binary to it that drives
Yeah.
me bananas. It's like you are either succeeding at this longevity movement or you're failing at this longevity movement
Hmm.
with no parameters around who we are actually supposed to be, how long. We have never lived this long in history, certainly
Hmm.
as healthfully as we are. And for many people, living long not healthfully because of medical advances. And there's a
Hmm.
lot of conversation we need to have as a society around just because we can doesn't mean we should. Like that is,
Yeah.
I feel, a really, really important umbrella question that we need to ask ourselves as we get into our senior years. What do we want to be? Because you are not biohacking your way out of dying. That is
Well, I
100%
don't know.
true.
Maybe some people think they are, but but you're right. I mean, I think it's very dystopian because I think it's these movements all I'd say, well, maybe it emerges out of San Francisco or Silicon Valley area, but I'd say these movements all have a lot in common. And I'm not sure if you've kind of like heard of this movement called like transhumanism. Where people are like almost dreaming of when humans merge with machines. It's like the same people who are worshiping at the altar of artificial intelligence. I feel like there's something deeply disturbing and dystopian about all of these movements, and they all seem to kind of originate, with similar beliefs. And many of these people, which I find kind of odd, are dreaming of the day when like the next thing beyond human, that is a AI or a cyborg, human AI that can kind of live longer, live forever. And I just find, it's kind of, yeah, it's like it's not my cup of tea. But many of these movements are, at least at the deep philosophical level, originating from that transhuman belief. And to me, as like a spiritual person, I think that these movements are the arrogance of man pretending that man is God. And I find that deeply disturbing. So whenever I hear things out of these AI companies, out of these robotics, transhumanism, kind of movements, I just think it's not. Yeah, I hope that doesn't propagate.
Once again, another conversation with you and I that I feel could go on for a decade. And that
Yeah.
brings me to my next question, which is the caregiving crisis, which we talked about in our first episode. If for anybody who hasn't listened to that, go back and listen to the first episode with Neil and I. I think that there's a lot of really interesting things, and many, many, many people thought that there were interesting things in that episode, as we saw in the numbers. So please go back and listen. But when we talk about this caregiving crisis that is at our doorstep primarily because of our aging population and the big large swath of baby boomers who are entering their eighth decade, where do you think the caregiving crisis will most be felt?
Probably, I mean, hate to say it, but by middle-aged women. I think it's going to be felt mostly because of the way the society is set up by women in their 50s who are working and who suddenly have to become a caregiver for mom or dad. And I think where it's going to be felt is, which is I hope the government can actually pay attention and do something, is when you start seeing like millions of mid-career women quitting to care for mom or dad. I think that's when you're kind of in the crisis. I personally feel from like running a lot of caregiving nations, we're already in the crisis. But I think maybe the tipping point will be over the next few years when it becomes obvious to everyone. And I think that that's a reason why a lot of policymaking conversations are starting to talk about this, because I don't think people are just going to quietly, do that without like demanding something better from their political representatives. But I think if I had to make a prediction by time, probably before the 2028 US presidential election, it will be obvious that there's a major caregiving crisis. Mainly because the oldest of the baby boomers started turning 80 in this year, 2026, right? Like 1946 was technically when the baby boom started post World War II. And 80 is typically when your long-term care needs skyrocket. And in terms of percentage probabilities of risk of getting dementia is like I think almost approaching a third when you hit 80. Risk of physical frailty, other functional decline, needing kind of in-home assistance, or potentially many people moving to like a assisted living or some sort of facility increases significantly when you're 80. So we are having just like the start of the wave of a large population cohort hitting that age without a lot of like social support infrastructure, and way more people are working now than a few decades ago. So I think that as we see millions of people potentially leave the workforce to deal with this, it'll be obvious that there's a crisis, and that is probably underway right now.
Where else do you see, Neil, something that can be done in short order to help caregivers tangibly?
Probably the easiest thing is from a government policy perspective. Like recently, a few weeks ago, I did a long YouTube video about that. I highly recommend people check out. But in America, 17 senators introduced a series of potential reforms to the Medicare system, which is like the predominant insurance system for older adults, and it's funded by government. And it was the first time there was a big move to directly pay caregivers and or directly pay for respite care so that family caregivers can get a break. To me, it's like a shot across the bow of like, okay, this is now enough representatives are talking about it. It's being introduced and it's just starting a conversation. I think, of course, there'll be negotiations by the different political parties, et cetera. But I think, as I discussed in the video, bipartisan, this thing has a lot of support. Johns Hopkins
Mhm.
did a major, major poll, and it was something like 82% of Democrats and 79% of Republicans, based on like party line voters, support government to do more for caregiving and for government to support and pay caregivers. So I think at some point, to me, it's obvious. Like if I was advising somebody that is running for political office here in the US, we have a big election coming up. The 2026 midterm elections is coming up in a few months. Like I think every candidate of all parties, you're running for Senate, you're running for a House seat, you should embrace caregiving and caregiving support. It's just obvious. Like even cynically, because if you cynically just think politicians are just like saying whatever to get votes, why not support this?
Yeah.
You can get votes. Say something about caregiving, introduce some policy and whatever. And then of course you hope that cynically, because I am deeply cynical about politics, cynically, if they're just like doing it to get votes and get ahead, the positive is if they embrace it and they run on it, then the likelihood of them having to do it when they get in is at least high. It might not be 100%, but it's high enough. Or otherwise, the next time you're up for election, you'll get thrown out and
Yeah.
somebody else will, So, but I think that the issue is now becoming obvious, I think, to the political class that, hey, there's votes here, and I think that eventually that's how change happens. I mean, it happens slowly, but it happens. I have a positive note that I positively predict that the government, by the end of this decade, will be funding a lot of caregiving. We'll be funding family caregivers to get paid. We'll be funding respite care for families so that they can get a break, caregivers in home. I just think it's inevitable. And despite all the machinations of the system and cynicism on politicians, it just seems like it will happen. Not even because the politicians have good intentions, but it's so obvious. It's so obvious from an economic standpoint. It's so obvious from a vote getting and voting population standpoint that it will inevitably happen because just the logic is there.
If we do nothing, if nothing changes, Neal, what happens to this large cohort of baby boomers who are turning
Mm,
80
mhm.
and for the people who care for them? What happens?
If we do nothing, I think millions of middle-aged people, not only women, also men. In the millennial generation, about 40% of the mom and dad's caregivers are male. So I'd say millions of middle-aged people will be dropping out of the workforce because they won't be able to afford to get care help for mom or dad because of how high the cost is. So they'll just end up doing it themselves. They will set themselves back massively in their own life. On average, caregivers lose 319,000 of lifetime earnings because they had to take a break to do caregiving, for mom or dad. So people will be screwed. Businesses will lose a large pool of the employees. So I think at that point, the businesses will also, in their own self interest, go and beg the government to do something about it. And for people who their children are not in that situation or children don't live nearby, millions of older adults will just go without care, which means, unfortunately, they will just die early. Because if you have dementia and you're living by yourself and you don't have your son or daughter or spouse helping and you can't afford to get caregivers, you're probably going to have falls, accidents, and die. So, yeah, I think it's like going to be a societal tragedy.
Well, you know
Yeah.
what? You know what? It's not gonna happen because the world has
Yeah.
Neal Shah and the world has the heart of it all, and you're gonna come back again, and we're gonna talk again, and we're gonna keep pushing this jello uphill and
Yeah.
really, really make people understand that we see them, we hear them, we're here for them, and we are going to, at some point on this podcast, be celebrating change.
Agreed. Hopefully soon.
Thanks, Neal.
Yeah. Thanks, Terry. Thanks for having me on. Wonderful conversation.
Well, we just love having Neal here on the heart of it all. I love how he thinks. We really are in line. His advocacy for caregivers is making a huge difference, and we hope that we're making a difference too. Thanks to so many of you for following wherever you are listening or watching, and to my co-producers, Jess and Carrie from 6 of 1 Digital. We do have new episodes each and every Tuesday, and we hope to have you back next week. Until next time, please take care. Well, Neal Shah bringing up transhumanism reminded me of a show that I watched ages ago. It's called Years and Years. It stars Emma Thompson. It's a 6-part show. It is dystopian. It is concerning. It is about human interaction. It is about choices people make about their lives and their deaths. It's fantastic, and it will definitely get you thinking. This week's recommendation is Years and Years.